Hello, my name is Amy Verdun. I'm here with Julia Jänisch from the University of Münster to talk about climate and energy policies in the European Union. So in 2019, the European Commission put forward the so-called European Green Deal, a program aimed at making the EU carbon neutral by 2050. What is the European Green Deal and how does the EU want to achieve its ambitious goals?
Thank you, Amy. So in the end of 2019, the at this time newly elected Commission President Ursula von der Leyen introduced the European Green Deal. And in her speech at the European Parliament, she labeled the deal as the Europe's man of the moon moment. So in other words, she wanted to stress that Europe is at a turning point facing a greener future. And you can say the European Green Deal is an expression of the need to address collaboratively climate and environmental related challenges under the sustainability goal. So one can resume the European Green Deal under basically three core elements. First of all, the EU wants to become climate neutral by 2050. This means that all emissions should also be recaptured to basically achieve an equilibrium. And this applies above all to the greenhouse gas CO2, which is harmful to the climate, as we know. Second, within the European Green Deal, the EU wants to separate economic growth from resource use. And this is a big point because it means to rethink the economy away from constantly new production and towards recycling, circular economy, and resource-saving production. And the third core element would be that regional needs in the process of achieving these goals shall be taken into account. So the EU is very diverse and different regions are at different points of development. So this should be kept in mind when implementing the European Green Deal. And to achieve these ambitious goals, the EU provides financial assistance to disadvantaged regions. Other priorities would be, for example, strengthening protected areas, supporting the EU industry, and rethinking consumption in general. Also, the energy sector shall be decarbonized, the use of harmful chemicals be curbed, and the transport sector emissions be reduced. And last point would be to create a more sustainable food system.
The EU's climate policy has evolved from its environmental policy, which started in the 1970s. What has the EU achieved in this policy field?
I'd say a lot. So the history of the EU's environmental policy began almost 50 years ago in 1973, following the first United Nations Conference on the Environment in Stockholm and the Club of Rome's internationally acclaimed report on the limits of growth. And since the EU adopted 8 so-called environmental action programs. Until today, there have been several achievements. For example, the 1980s were the time when the EU established the field of environmental policy in general. Much of the legislation focused on harmonizing the procedural and institutional basis for environmental policy across the member states. The Maastricht Treaty in 1993 broadened the range of policy instruments. Shortly after environmental policy, climate policy came onto the EU agenda. So in 1996, the EU was the first to set a 2-degree target. This had a formative influence on international climate negotiations. A milestone then was the introduction of the European Emission Trading System in 2005. This is a carbon trade system that sets a limit, so a cap, on total emissions of greenhouse gases to high-emitting industries by creating CO2 emission permits. These allow basically firms to buy and sell, so to trade permits and find the least costly mechanism to reduce emissions. Also, the EU introduced the so-called effort sharing regulation, by which member states commit to reduce their CO2 emissions significantly in all sectors unaffected by the European trading system.
A second field of EU policy that is essential for climate change mitigation is energy policy. How do the EU's powers over energy policy differ from those in environmental policy, and why is this significant?
So, the EU's competences in the fields of environmental and energy policy are subject to different legal principles. According to the EU's environmental competence, legislation is passed by a majority vote in the Council of the EU, and this makes it really easy to come to an agreement. And the resulting policy decisions are binding on the member states. So this is a really important point. The EU thus has a legal binding competence for the member states in the area of environmental policy. By contrast, in the field of energy policy, the EU can only define European policy objectives. As we can see from the current conflict with Russia, energy policy is closely related to foreign policy, and countries are generally unwilling to allow their foreign policy to be interfered with. So the EU has effectively no binding power to act in this field. In concrete terms, this means the EU is not allowed to intervene into the energy policy of the member states at all. So the EU has no right to intervene in their energy supply or their choice between different energy resources. And here we come to a crucial point, because energy is, of course, an essential component on the road to climate neutrality. So, but the EU has no de facto power in this case. It must rely on the actions and decisions of the member states.
How would you compare the challenges that the EU faces in the area of climate change mitigation and the policies that it has put forward in these areas to those of Canada?
So one of the biggest challenges the EU is facing is energy security. Russia's war against Ukraine has exacerbated the situation in Europe immensely. So especially in terms of heating, energy, fuel production, and industry, Europe is extremely dependent on fossil imports. And now the EU faces kind of a dilemma. Occasionally, these imports will soon no longer be available, but energy security must be guaranteed. And at the same time, fossil imports must be reduced anyway if we want to become climate neutral. So this is a huge challenge the EU is facing. Also, the share of renewable energies in electricity production must be expanded. The current EU-wide 60% is far too little. In contrast, energy security is not a concern in Canada because the country is a net exporter of oil, natural gas, coal, and electricity. Also, the share of electricity coming from renewable resources is significantly higher in Canada, with about 3/4. The challenge for Canada, on the other hand, will be to reduce its CO2 emissions. The country has really high emissions, which is mainly due to the production of fossil fuels. This is important for the Canadian economy, but regarding the targeted climate neutrality by 2050, a rethink will also be required here. So, as can be seen from both the EU and Canada, the reduction of fossil energies is essential.
So you've already spoken a bit about this, but how has the Russian invasion in Ukraine that started in February 2022 affected EU climate change and energy policy?
So Russia's invasion of Ukraine has definitely turned the EU energy policy upside down. So the war poses the greatest challenge to European security of energy supply since the Second World War. And at the same time, the EU has set itself the goal to becoming climate neutral by 2050. And now the EU will probably have to give up fossil fuels sooner than originally planned. However, it must be mentioned again that the EU still has no competences in the field of energy policy. This should be kept in mind when we talk about this topic. But still, Russia was always considered a reliable supplier of fossil fuels, especially for the nations in the east of Europe and also for the big industrial nations like Germany, who were and still are extremely dependent on Russia. And now the existential question is how to heat in winter, and more important, how energy-intensive industries such as steel, chemicals, or pharmaceuticals can be maintained. And to become less dependent on Russia and to achieve the climate goals, the European Commission presented the so-called RePower EU plan in May 2022. In the plan, the EU formulates basically 4 objectives. So the first would be to increase the energy transition. The second would be to save energy. The third would be to diversify the energy imports. And last, to link these reforms to investment. However, these targets are not binding for the member states. So it is to be hoped that the absolute necessity that now exists to become independent of fossil energies will give climate neutrality a boost. Much has been overlooked in recent years and must be corrected now. And historically, drastic crises can also bring overdue developments, and let us hope that this will be the case here.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you.